But moving on, and into, I suppose, in that sense, activism. There's a nice link here, and that is that earlier this month, on the 22nd of April, there was the March for Science. This actually occurred on World Earth Day, and was it's it was broadly speaking a success across the world. People turned up for the most part in capital cities, but large urban environments. But also as well, it's kind of also been a bit of a target for people to sort of highlight, ironically, a sense of intransigence and lack of tolerance in the scientific community. I mean, how would you characterise the March for Science? I mean, for example, I know a few people who marched in London, a few people who marched in New York, this kind of thing. How would you characterise it?
Well, first of all, and I thought it was very interesting that people did mobilise, and people who were happy to mobilise and identify as archaeologists as part of a wider scientific community.
You make it sound like we're coming out of the archaeological.
Is archaeology a science or a humanity?
Yeah. We have statistics, honestly.
But in fact, the thing that most attracted me to the coverage, and I have, unfortunately, I couldn't go to the march in London. I was at a prior engagement, but the thing that caught my eye was Jane Siddell, who is an inspector with Historic England, a very senior and respected archaeologist with a speciality in the environment. Posted a wonderful selfie of her with the current Doctor Who, Peter Capaldi, and I think that sort of encapsulated the lightness of touch, actually, that the march had. It was engaging, it was serious, it was also humorous, and that particular picture made the link between serious, top-of-the-range archaeological science at Historic England and in the British academic archaeology community, but also a television programme which is popular all over the world, and where the hero believes, is always talking about facts and evidence and being brave and how wonderful and clever and innovative human beings are. And that was a lovely juxtaposition, and I'm all credit for posting that picture on Twitter. I think it was terrific. Encapsulation of the whole event.
Absolutely. I mean, well, having just talked a little bit about the upcoming general election, this actually brings up another sort of topical element here with this March for Science, and that is it has been attacked, as I say, by some journalists, for example, as showing a sort of a monostatic, I suppose, this sort of immovable one track mind of science, supposedly on a global level, trying to force, especially national.
I know these bloody facts. I know people insist.
I know facts.
Trying to break down these barriers. But they will put these facts on the table, which you can't dispute. It's terrible.
It's so annoying, and whether you're British or American or French, you can't dispute the facts. It's so annoying. But the point is, though, is that it's interesting how it's being painted by some people as essentially. Well, I mean, one article here, for example, from a news website called Spiked, Spiked, talked about how this march actually had more to do with almost like a medieval view, a church world view, trying to force people to follow their religion. Now, obviously, I'm on the other side of the fence. I obviously firmly believe in science and facts, but it is fascinating how this is being painted as, in that sense, anti-nationalistic. Now, and the reason why I've taken a little bit of a time to come to that little word there is that I suppose it highlights this question that we were touching on when we were talking about the general election, where people want to sort of separate out practice and politics, archaeological practice and politics, or in this case science and politics. And so people don't seem to understand that international collaboration lends itself to a perspective that is inherently political, but therefore politically charged, I guess, because some people really don't like it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, taking Spiked as an example, the Spiked as a website and the people behind it, it's one of those hybrids in the online media where it's a sort of coming together of people whose backgrounds over many years are either on the far left or what's now called the alt-right, which tend to both be libertarian and anarchic, and anything that smacks of the establishment is the enemy. So you have to look behind the agendas there. I think that when it comes to something like that, that kind of coverage, and when it comes to, I think we have to accept that all of us who work in any kind of academic discipline, as I said, we know actually, and particularly now when communication is so easy around the world through mediums like the one we're using now, that we are part of an international community, and that breaks down identities and borders and walls in ways that were never possible in the past. And it makes information more available than it ever was in the past, but it also makes it more vulnerable to manipulation than it ever was in the past. And I think it's a recurring theme of these chats of ours, these podcasts, the whole issue of what is and isn't real, quotes true, quotes fake.
And also,
I think in the end, what the march was about saying, look, we're out there around the world, trying to do our best to make sense of the complexities of this world we're living in, and we work together, and we put information out there for you to inform the rest of you, the public, or we should do, if we're doing our job properly, and you can take it or leave it. But actually, if you prefer to believe that the world's flat, actually we think you're wrong, and we think we can demonstrate you're wrong, and that's just tough.
To be fair, I think it was Aristarchus in the 3rd century BC who totally proved it wasn't flat. So you've got to be fairly dogged in your opinion. But actually, it's you've got to be no. I'm sticking to the party line. It's flat. No, but it's interesting because and I am totally being devil's advocate here, but I think it's worthwhile just doing that.
We have to.
Yeah, we have to.
Can't be complacent.
Because, for example, on the Our Mission page of the March for Science, it does mention here, we united as a diverse, non-partisan group to call for science that upholds the common good, and for political leaders and policymakers to enact evidence-based policies in the public interest.
And we all know who that's aimed at.
Yeah, well, yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? How they're having to be a political activist, and I suppose the reason why I can't help but try to sort of see the perspective of people who are complaining about this is that at the same time you do have people saying, oh no, we're just marching for scientific truth and facts, and yet at the same time taking placards down to Parliament Square or whatever, trying to get to College Green or something, or on the Capitol in Washington, is by it is an act of lobbying. It is an act of trying to sway the political agenda. So I in that sense, being devil's advocate, I can see why some people are jumping on it. If that's what I mean.
But then I'd make the analogy, for example, look, one of the things that has prompted this is the attitude to climate change, human-influenced climate change, that has been coming predominantly from the alt-right, which is basically to dismiss the concept for whatever reasons. But it's basically, and now you have a situation where the current president of the United States, who we have to accept was elected by the American electoral system, has been defunded, or has stated he wants to defund programs that both research and educate about the ideas of human influence climate change. Now, there I draw the analogy of somebody who lives in a street and they see the house opposite catch fire. Do they sit and think, well, okay, somebody else is bound to notice that house on fire and call the fire brigade? Or are you proactive and pick up the phone because you've got direct knowledge of what is going on in the real world in real time and call the fire brigade to put the fire out. I think that's what we look. That's the attitude that the scientific community is taking at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But also as well, I suppose there's an interesting element here in so much as that is what was voted for, though. The political system did result in essentially climate change deniers. Someone who wants to, the vice president, for example, in the US, wants to see evolution taught as theory, not fact, and so again, devil's advocate. I can it's one of those things where you can see how this might be seen as a distasteful political act, forcing your will long after, or indeed in this instance just before a general election in this country.
I think the point is there, Mark. I think it's forcing your will, if you like, but only through effectively trying to persuade. Nobody put barricades up in the streets. Nobody threw petrol bombs at the police. No. It was about yeah, exactly, truth bombs.
Mm-hmm.
In all seriousness, it was an act of, to use a religious term, which is probably not appropriate, but I'm going to use it anyway because I think it also works in a secular context. It was an act of witness. It was saying, I believe this, take it or leave it, but I'm prepared to stand my ground and say that I believe this, and that becomes then part of the political discourse. I think people would argue, and again it goes back to the poll we were talking about earlier, people might want to, should be at least have the opportunity to make decisions based on the fullest possible information. And when you defund a program that comes from a particular part of that argument, then you're denying your electorate that information, and that's not democratic.
And I suppose actually coming back now, no longer being devil's advocate, feel much safer here. Coming back to that, I suppose, in that sense, one of the key elements here is the fact that political leaders have to, and are expected to, serve in the public interest. So, for example, this is one of the reasons why in this country I'm actually very proud of the fact that we get very uncomfortable when someone perhaps is, for example, in this country we've had atheist leaders, for example. We've had leaders who are atheist, but at the same time also they stand up for the legal rights of the structure that they support. So, for example, the Church of England, they don't take it upon themselves to then enact a wholesale change in education, forcing their beliefs on the country that they're governing. And the same goes the other way as well. For example, at the moment, I think the leader of the Liberal Democrats is a born again Christian.
Indeed, Tim Farron, yes.
But he seems to genuinely want to govern for the people, not for Christians. And in that sense, I think it's interesting how politics is very partisan, but governments shouldn't be. And maybe that's one way of looking at this sort of march, is reminding those in charge that actually you're governing the country now. You're not just pleasing a demographic. That's
absolutely right. And I think, the Tim Farron, the liberal position was described to me by actually somebody who is a liberal activist the other day, which is that the genuinely liberal position is to live and let live and allow people freedom until it impinges damagingly on somebody else.
Yeah. So I think I negotiated that particular devil's advocate session quite well. I'll put my red mask and pitchforks to one side for a bit. But no, it is interesting, and especially, I suppose this conversation is worthwhile because what it highlights is the fact that well-meaning scientists cannot pretend to be politically benign. If that's what I mean. And there's a tendency, I think, to go, but I'm just a scientist. I just deal with statistics, as I was saying before. But actually, the fact that the statistics lead you to a conclusion, and that conclusion can have an effect, for example, on global climate, means that it is a politically weighted conclusion. It's a politically weighted assertion in that sense, and so you can't be benign. You can't just be in the middle.
No, absolutely, and I think just make one final very brief point, which is that I think the kind of attitude that you've just described was, broadly speaking, tenable for the last 30, 40 years under what's been called a liberal consensus,
Mm.
uh, which is almost like a sort of, if you like, a modern version of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And I think the certainties of that liberal consensus are actually breaking down at the moment. They're certainly in flux. And that's why we see one of the reasons we're seeing the manifestations we're seeing, like the March for Science.
Yeah. Which is, broadly speaking, March for Science. I do get behind that. I can't not support that. Surely, if someone was marching for baby tomatoes, I have to say, I wouldn't support that. I'd have a big problem with that because they pop in your mouth like an eyeball. It's horrible. So, so you and I, we'd fight in the street. Anyway.
Sliced up with garlic and olive oil, absolutely delicious.
Actually, sun-dried. We could meet in the middle. We could leave them on the street for a while, sun-dry them, add some garlic, some lovely... Oh, that'd be nice. Anyway, sorry. Moving on.
We'll have to start doing Recipe of the Month as well.
A Recipe of the Month, exactly.